You're standing in the commander's cupola of an M4 Sherman, somewhere in the hedgerow country south of Carentan. And through the dust and smoke drifting across the bocage, you've just spotted the angular silhouette of a Panther tank 200 yards ahead. Your 75mm gun, the one that's been called a cigarette lighter by crews who've seen their rounds bounce harmlessly off German armor, is all you have. The Panther's frontal armor is 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of nearly 140mm. Your AP round can penetrate maybe 90mm at this range, and only if you hit it perfectly square. The Panther's 75mm KW-42 can punch through your tank's armor from 1,000 yards away. Every tactical manual, every after-action report, every piece of armor doctrine you've been taught says you're outmatched. The smart move is to call for air support, artillery, tank destroyers, anything but a direct engagement. But there's no time for that. The Panther's turret is already traversing toward your position. This is the reality that American tank crews faced in Normandy during the summer of 1944, and it's the moment that defined one of the most analyzed, mythologized, and misunderstood armored engagements of the entire Western European campaign. On July 11, 1944, near the village of Le Désert in Normandy, 5 M4 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armored Division encountered 9 Panther tanks from the Panzer Lehr Division in close terrain. When the smoke cleared 30 minutes later, all 9 Panthers were destroyed or abandoned. All 5 Shermans survived. The engagement violated every assumption about how armor combat was supposed to work. It contradicted the narrative that had already begun to calcify in the American armored force. That the Sherman was hopelessly outclassed, that German armor superiority was insurmountable, that crew skill couldn't overcome technological disadvantage. But it happened. And understanding how it happened requires peeling back 70 years of pop culture mythology about the Sherman, the Panther, and what actually determined the outcome of tank battles in the close, vegetated hell of the Norman bocage. This is the story of how terrain, tactics, training, and timing mattered more than armor thickness. How 5 American crews exploited every advantage the landscape gave them, while 9 German crews made every mistake the Wehrmacht's crumbling tactical doctrine encouraged. And how one engagement proved that the tank battle everyone thinks they understand, the duel of frontal armor at long range, was never the battle being fought in Normandy at all. To understand what happened at Le Désert, you need to understand what the bocage did to armored warfare. The hedgerow country of Normandy wasn't farmland in any recognizable sense. It was a medieval agricultural landscape that had evolved over 1,000 years into a natural fortress. Each field was surrounded by earthen berms 4 to 6 feet high, crowned with dense hedgerows of hawthorn, oak, and bramble that could grow another 10 feet above the berm. The fields themselves were small, often no more than 100 yards across. Roads were sunken lanes, worn down by centuries of use until they sat 10 feet below the surrounding terrain, with the hedgerows forming walls on either side. For tanks, this terrain was a nightmare. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. You couldn't see the next field until you crested the hedgerow. And cresting the hedgerow meant exposing your tank's thin belly armor to anyone waiting on the other side. You couldn't maneuver around obstacles because there was nowhere to maneuver. You had to move through the bocage in single file along the sunken roads or risk getting stuck trying to bash through a hedgerow. And once you were in a sunken lane, you were trapped, unable to traverse your turret fully, unable to back up quickly, unable to see anything except the narrow corridor directly ahead. The Americans learned this in blood during the first weeks after D-Day. Entire tank companies would advance into the bocage and simply disappear, destroyed one by one as they nosed through hedgerow gaps or crawled down sunken roads. The kill range dropped from the 1,000 yards assumed in armor school to less than 200. Often it was closer to 50 yards, close enough to hear the enemy tank's engine before you saw it. At those ranges, tactical doctrine went out the window. There was no time for careful scouting, no opportunity for hull-down positions, no chance to use your superior numbers or artillery support. Just point-blank murder in green tunnels. The Germans, for all their armor superiority, suffered from the same problems. A Panther tank was designed for the open terrain of the Eastern Front. Long sight lines, sweeping flanks, high-speed maneuvers. It was a breakthrough weapon meant to shatter Soviet tank formations at range and exploit the gaps. In the bocage, none of that mattered. The Panther's superior gun couldn't engage targets it couldn't see. Its sloped armor was wasted against shots fired from 50 yards at side angles. Its weight, 45 tons compared to the Sherman's 30, made it slower to reverse, harder to maneuver, and more likely to get stuck in the mud that filled every sunken lane after a rainstorm. And by July 1944, the Panthers of Panzer Lehr weren't operating under ideal conditions. The division had been savaged by Allied air attacks during its movement to Normandy. Fuel shortages were chronic. Spare parts were non-existent. Crew quality was declining as experienced tankers were killed or transferred and replaced with barely trained teenagers from the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. The Panther itself, for all its fearsome reputation, was mechanically unreliable even under optimal conditions. Final drives failed. Transmissions broke, engines overheated. In Normandy's mud and heat, with no proper maintenance, facilities and constant air attacks, the Panther's operational readiness hovered around 50%. Half the tanks that were theoretically available couldn't move. But the myth of German armor superiority persisted, especially among Allied crews. By July, American tankers had internalized a simple narrative. German tanks were better, and the only way to kill them was with overwhelming numbers, artillery support, or airstrikes. Tank versus tank engagements were to be avoided. If you encountered a Panther or Tiger, you called for help. You didn't fight. That doctrine was about to be tested. The 2nd Armored Division was pushing south from St. Lo as part of Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive. The division's 3rd Battalion, 66th Armored Regiment, was tasked with securing the village of Le Désert and the roads beyond. It was a straightforward assignment: clear the village, establish a defensive perimeter, wait for infantry support to consolidate the position. But intelligence reports were thin. No one knew if the Germans were still holding Le Désert in strength or if they'd already pulled back. No one knew if there were German armor in the area. The battalion moved cautiously, advancing in column along a narrow road that cut through dense hedgerows. The lead tank was commanded by Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole, a 24-year-old Texan who would go on to become one of the most lethal tank commanders in the European theater. By the end of the war, Poole's crew would be credited with destroying 258 enemy vehicles, including 12 tanks. But on July 11, 1944, he was just another sergeant leading a platoon through the bocage. The column rounded a bend in the road, and suddenly, the world exploded. A Panther opened fire from a hidden position less than 100 yards ahead. Its first shot, a clean miss that screamed past Poole's turret and detonated somewhere behind him. There was no time to think. Poole's gunner, Corporal Wilbert Richards, traversed onto the target and fired. The AP round hit the Panther's gun mantlet and penetrated, detonating the ammunition stored behind it. The Panther erupted in flame, its turret lifting slightly as the internal explosion vented through every hatch and seam. First kill. But the rest of the German tanks were already moving. The Panthers had been positioned in a loose defensive screen south of Le Désert, waiting for exactly this kind of American advance. They'd chosen their positions carefully, hull down behind hedgerows, angled to cover the road, with clear escape routes to the rear. It should have been a textbook ambush. But the lead Panthers crew had fired too early, revealing their position before the American column was fully committed to the kill zone. And in doing so, they'd given Poole and his platoon the one thing they needed most: awareness. You're in the gunner's seat now, and the adrenaline is so overwhelming you can barely hear the commander's orders over the intercom. The WWII optics are fogged from the heat inside the turret. Your right hand is on the traverse crank, your left on the elevation wheel, and your thumb is hovering over the firing trigger. The loader behind you is screaming that he's up, AP round loaded, breech closed. You can see another Panther nosing through a hedgerow gap 300 yards to the left. It hasn't seen you yet. Its turret is pointed slightly away, maybe covering a different sector. You've got 5 seconds, maybe 10, before that turret swings toward you. Your fingers are shaking. The manual says you're supposed to aim for the lower glacis or the turret ring, but at this angle all you can see is the frontal armor, the part that's supposed to be impenetrable. You aim anyway. You fire. The Sherman rocks back from the recoil. The AP round crosses 300 yards in less than a second and hits the Panther's gun mantlet, right where the armor is thickest, but also where the internal geometry creates a shot trap. A spot where even a deflected round can bounce downward into the hull roof. The Panther stops. Smoke begins pouring from its engine deck. You don't wait to see if it's dead. You're already traversing to find the next target. What happened next is recorded in the after-action reports filed by the 2nd Armored Division. But the reports are dry, factual, stripped of the chaos and terror that defined the engagement. They list the kills, the ammunition expenditure, the casualties: 0 American tanks lost, 9 German tanks destroyed. But they don't capture the speed of it. The way decisions had to be made in half seconds, the way Poole and his platoon adapted to the terrain and turned it into a weapon. Poole's 5 Shermans didn't charge the Panthers. They didn't retreat and call for artillery. They moved laterally, using the hedgerows as cover the same way infantry used buildings in urban combat. One tank would advance to a hedgerow gap, pause, scan for targets. If they spotted a Panther, they'd fire and immediately reverse, disappearing back into cover before the Germans could return fire. Another Sherman would advance through a different gap 50 yards away, forcing the Panthers to split their attention. The Germans were used to fighting Soviet tank waves, massed charges that could be broken with superior firepower. They weren't prepared for this kind of fluid, opportunistic movement. And the Americans were exploiting every technical advantage the Sherman actually had. The Sherman's gun wasn't as powerful as the Panther's, but it was faster to reload, 7 seconds versus 9. The Sherman's turret traverse was powered, allowing the gunner to track moving targets smoothly and quickly. The Panther's traverse was also powered, but its system was unreliable and slower under combat stress. The Sherman's crew layout was better. The loader had more room to work, the commander had better visibility from the cupola. The driver and bow gunner could communicate more easily. These weren't glamorous advantages. They didn't show up in the technical specifications that armor enthusiasts argued over. But in a close-range knife fight where fractions of a second determined who lived and who died, they mattered. The Germans made mistakes. The Panther crews were operating in isolation, without infantry support, without effective communication between tanks. When one Panther spotted a Sherman, the other Panthers didn't know where to look. They traversed wildly, trying to acquire targets in terrain that limited their vision to narrow sightlines through hedgerow gaps. Some Panthers tried to reverse and reposition, but the sunken lanes and soft ground made reverse movement painfully slow. A Panther weighing 45 tons could get bogged down in seconds if the driver picked the wrong line. And once a Panther was stuck, it was dead. Immobilized targets were easy kills even for the Sherman's 75mm gun. Poole's crew found a Panther attempting to reverse through a narrow gap. The German tank was stuck, its tracks spinning in the mud, the engine roaring as the driver desperately tried to free it. Poole's gunner put a round through the Panther's thin rear armor, penetrating the engine compartment and igniting the fuel tanks. The crew bailed out and ran. Another Panther tried to advance through a hedgerow, thinking it could crush through and escape. The tank crested the berm, exposing its belly armor. Poole's Sherman, positioned behind a different hedgerow, fired upward into the exposed underside. The Panther died before it hit the ground on the other side. By now, the Germans realized they were losing. The Panthers began withdrawing, trying to break contact and retreat to a fallback position. But retreating in the bocage was just as dangerous as advancing. The narrow lanes forced the Panthers to move in single file, and the lead tank in any column was hideously vulnerable. Poole's platoon pursued, moving through parallel lanes, popping through gaps to fire at the retreating German column from the flank. The Panthers couldn't stop to return fire without bunching up and creating a traffic jam. They couldn't speed up because the lanes were too narrow and the risk of throwing a track was too high. All they could do was keep moving and hope they made it to open ground before they were all destroyed. They didn't. One Panther threw a track trying to navigate a sharp turn. It slewed sideways, blocking the lane. The Panther behind it tried to push past and got stuck in the same spot. Both tanks were abandoned by their crews. A third Panther, attempting to take a different route, nosed through a hedgerow gap and found itself face to face with a Sherman at 30 yards. At that range, the Sherman's gun could penetrate anything. The Panther's crew didn't even try to fight. They bailed out before the Sherman fired. The engagement lasted 30 minutes. When it was over, 9 Panthers were either destroyed, disabled, or abandoned. Poole's 5 Shermans hadn't taken a single penetrating hit. 2 had been struck by glancing rounds that scarred the armor but didn't penetrate. 1 had a damaged track from reversing over a hedgerow route, but it was repaired within an hour. The after-action report noted the kills, praised the crews, and moved on. There were 100 other engagements happening across Normandy that same day. But within the 2nd Armored Division, the story spread. 5 Shermans, 9 Panthers, 0 losses. It was the kind of engagement that shouldn't have been possible. And yet it happened. So what does it mean? How do you square this engagement with the popular narrative that the Sherman was a death trap? That German armor was invincible, that American crews only survived through overwhelming numbers? The answer is that the popular narrative was always incomplete. It's not that the Sherman was a great tank. By the standards of 1944, it was adequate at best. Its armor was thin. Its gun was underpowered. Its tendency to catch fire when penetrated earned it the grim nickname Ronson among some crews, after the cigarette lighter that claimed to light every time. But the Sherman was reliable, fast, easy to repair, and produced in staggering quantities. More importantly, American doctrine emphasized combined arms, tanks working with infantry, artillery, and air support. The Sherman wasn't supposed to fight Panthers alone. It was supposed to be one element in a larger system. But at Le Désert, the system didn't matter. There was no air support. The engagement happened too fast. There was no artillery. Poole's platoon had advanced beyond the range of the supporting guns. There was no infantry. They were still moving up through the previous objective. It was just 5 Shermans and 9 Panthers in close terrain. And the Shermans won because their crews understood the terrain better, moved faster, communicated more effectively, and exploited the mistakes the German crews made. The Panther, for all its technical superiority, was a victim of its own doctrine. German armored tactics in 1944 were still built around the principles that had worked on the Eastern Front. long-range engagements, superior firepower, breakthrough operations. But Normandy wasn't the Eastern Front. The terrain didn't allow for long-range duels. The fuel shortages didn't allow for sweeping maneuvers. The air superiority the Allies enjoyed made daylight movement suicidal. The Panthers were fighting in an environment they weren't designed for, supported by a logistics system that was collapsing, crewed by men who were increasingly inexperienced and demoralized. And the Americans were learning. The early weeks of Normandy had been brutal for American armor. High losses, shattered units, crews who climbed out of their burning tanks swearing they'd never get in another one. But the survivors learned. They learned to move cautiously, to use the terrain, to work with infantry, to exploit the brief moments when German armor was vulnerable. They learned that the Panther's thick frontal armor didn't matter if you could shoot it in the side. They learned that the Panther's powerful gun was useless if you never gave it a clear shot. They learned that aggression and speed could overcome technical disadvantage. Lafayette Poole embodied that learning. He would survive the war with 12 confirmed tank kills and dozens more unconfirmed. His Sherman, nicknamed "In the Mood," would be knocked out 3 times and repaired each time. Poole himself would be wounded in September 1944 when his tank hit a mine, losing a leg but surviving. He'd return to Texas, marry his girlfriend, and live until 1991, rarely speaking about the war. The men who served with him remembered a commander who was calm under fire, who trusted his crew, who understood that tank combat in Normandy wasn't about having the best tank. It was about using the tank you had as effectively as possible. The engagement at Le Désert didn't change the war. It was a small action in a massive campaign, one of thousands of armored clashes across France that summer. The 2nd Armored Division continued pushing south. Panzer Lehr continued trying to hold the line with dwindling resources and mounting losses. By the end of July, the division would be shattered, its Panthers destroyed or abandoned, its crews dead or captured. The American breakout would succeed, and the front would race east toward Germany. But the engagement did change the narrative, at least for the men who fought it. It proved that the Sherman could win, that American crews could outfight German crews, that terrain and tactics mattered more than armor specifications. It gave American tankers something they desperately needed: confidence. Not the blind confidence of inexperience, but the earned confidence of men who had faced the best the Wehrmacht had and survived. There's a tendency in military history to reduce complex events to simple lessons. The Sherman was bad. The Panther was good. German engineering was superior. American industry compensated for inferior equipment. These narratives are comforting because they're simple, but they obscure the messy reality of combat. The truth is that the outcome of tank battles in Normandy wasn't determined by which tank had thicker armor or a more powerful gun. It was determined by terrain, visibility, crew training, mechanical reliability, logistics, doctrine, morale, and 1,000 other factors that don't fit neatly into a technical comparison chart. The Panther was a formidable weapon when used correctly, at long range, in open terrain, with proper support. But in the bocage, those conditions rarely existed. The Sherman was a mediocre weapon by the standards of late-war armor design, but it was reliable, plentiful, and crewed by men who learned quickly. In the specific conditions of Normandy, close terrain, limited visibility, fluid tactical situations, the Sherman's advantages mattered more than its disadvantages. And the men mattered most of all. Poole and his crew didn't win at Le Désert because they had better equipment. They won because they stayed calm when the ambush was sprung, because they adapted to the terrain instead of fighting against it, because they moved aggressively when the Germans hesitated. They won because they made fewer mistakes than the enemy. And in armored combat, the side that makes fewer mistakes usually survives. The engagement is still studied at armor schools, though often with the wrong lessons drawn from it. Some analysts focus on the technical details, the kill ranges, the ammunition types, the penetration angles. Others focus on the terrain, using it as an example of how geography shapes tactics. But the real lesson is simpler and harder to quantify. That competence, aggression, and adaptability can overcome material disadvantage. That the crew matters more than the machine. That training, leadership, and experience are force multipliers that don't show up in any technical manual. Lafayette Poole understood this instinctively. In later interviews, he rarely talked about the technical specifications of his Sherman or the Panthers he destroyed. He talked about his crew, the gunner who could identify targets faster than anyone else in the battalion, the loader who could maintain a steady rate of fire even under incoming rounds, the driver who could navigate the bocage's nightmare terrain without getting stuck. He talked about trust, communication, and the way a good crew operated as a single organism. The tank was just the shell they operated inside. That's the truth that tends to get lost in the mythology. The Sherman wasn't a great tank, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to be good enough, and in the hands of competent crews with proper support, it was. The Panther was a great tank on paper. But paper doesn't account for fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, inexperienced crews, or terrain that negates every technical advantage. The engagement at Le Désert happened because 5 American crews exploited every advantage they had, while 9 German crews failed to exploit theirs. The machines mattered, but the men mattered more. By the end of July 1944, the bocage fighting was effectively over. Operation Cobra shattered the German line, and the front became fluid. American armor raced across France in a war of movement that looked nothing like the claustrophobic nightmare of Normandy. The hedgerows were replaced by open roads, destroyed villages, and desperate German rearguards. The Sherman's advantages, reliability, speed, operational range, became decisive. The Panthers' advantages, armor and firepower, became increasingly irrelevant as the Wehrmacht lost the ability to concentrate its armor for effective counterattacks. The Panzer Division, which had fielded the 9 Panthers destroyed at Le Désert, was withdrawn from the line in late July with fewer than 30 operational tanks remaining from an initial strength of over 200. It would be rebuilt, refitted, and thrown back into combat during the Battle of the Bulge, where it would suffer similar losses. By the end of the war, Panzer Lehr had been destroyed and rebuilt 3 times. Its Panthers were formidable weapons, but they couldn't overcome the strategic and logistical collapse of the Wehrmacht. The 2nd Armored Division continued fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany. It would participate in the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push to the Elbe River. Lafayette Poole would be wounded before the division reached Germany, but his crew would continue fighting, rotating through new commanders and new tanks, adding to the tally of kills they'd begun at Le Désert. The Sherman tanks they crewed would be replaced multiple times, some destroyed, some worn out, some simply upgraded to newer models. But the crews remained, carrying with them the lessons learned in the bocage. One of those lessons was that victory in armored combat wasn't about having the perfect weapon. It was about using the weapon you had in the way the terrain and situation demanded. The Germans never fully learned this lesson. They continued designing heavier, more powerful tanks. The Panther's successor, the Panther II, was planned but never built. The Tiger II entered service and proved even more unreliable than its predecessor. German doctrine remained fixated on the idea that superior technology would compensate for strategic disadvantage. It never did. The Americans, by contrast, embraced the idea that the Sherman was good enough. They focused on improving crew training, refining tactics, and integrating armor more effectively with infantry and artillery. They developed the Rhino hedgerow cutter that allowed Shermans to bash through bocage without exposing their belly armor. They experimented with upgunned versions of the Sherman, fitting some with 76mm guns that could penetrate Panther armor more reliably. But they never stopped production of the basic 75mm Sherman, because they understood that the tank's real value lay in its reliability and availability, not its firepower. This pragmatism defined the American approach to armored warfare for the rest of the war. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't produce the kind of superweapons that captured the imagination of military enthusiasts. But it worked. The Sherman never became a great tank. But it became a good enough tank crewed by well-trained men supported by overwhelming logistics. And in the end, that was sufficient. There's a photograph from the WWII engagement, taken a few hours after the fighting ended. It shows one of the destroyed Panthers, its turret blown off by an internal ammunition explosion, sitting in a narrow lane between two hedgerows. An American soldier stands next to it for scale. The Panther looks enormous, even in death. Angular, menacing, the kind of machine that should have been unstoppable, but it's just sitting there, immobilized and empty, testament to the fact that even the best weapon is useless if it can't be employed effectively. You can find that photograph in archives, in books about Normandy, in online galleries dedicated to World War II armor. It's usually captioned with the basic facts. Panther AOSF, G, destroyed by American forces, July 1944. But the photograph doesn't tell you about the 30 minutes of chaos that led to that moment. It doesn't tell you about the crews who fought in close terrain with inadequate weapons and won through skill and aggression. It doesn't tell you about Lafayette Poole or Wilbert Richards, or the other men whose names appear in the after-action reports, but rarely in the popular histories. That's the nature of history. The machines are photographed and preserved and argued over. The men fade into lists of names and unit designations. The tactical decisions that determined the outcome, the split-second choices about when to fire, when to move, when to press the attack, and when to pull back, are compressed into dry summaries that strip away the fear and confusion and desperate improvisation that characterized every second of the engagement. But the truth remains. On July 11th, 1944, near a village whose name most people have never heard, 5 American tank crews proved that the narrative everyone believed about armor combat in Normandy was incomplete. They proved that training, tactics, and terrain could overcome technical disadvantage. They proved that the Sherman, for all its flaws, was capable of winning against supposedly superior opponents when crewed by men who understood how to fight. It wasn't the last time American Shermans would destroy German Panthers, and it wasn't the most tactically significant engagement of the Normandy campaign. But it was the engagement that proved the war in the bocage wasn't determined by which side had the better tank. It was determined by which side had the better crews, the better tactics, and the willingness to exploit every advantage the situation offered. The Panthers at Le Désert were destroyed by 75mm guns, firing armor-piercing rounds that shouldn't have been able to penetrate their frontal armor. But they weren't firing at frontal armor. They were firing at flanks, at turret rings, at engine decks, at gun mantlets where shot traps created vulnerabilities. They were firing at bogged-down tanks that couldn't maneuver, at surprised crews that couldn't react fast enough, at isolated vehicles that didn't have mutual support. They were exploiting every mistake the Germans made while minimizing their own vulnerabilities. That's not the dramatic story of technological superiority overcoming inferior equipment. It's the messier, more human story of competent professionals doing their jobs under impossible circumstances and coming out alive. It's the story of men who climbed into tanks every morning knowing they were outgunned and out-armored, but still found ways to win. It's the story that gets lost when we reduce combat to a comparison of technical specifications. Lafayette Poole never thought of himself as a hero. In the few interviews he gave after the war, he deflected praise and talked about his crew, about luck, about the terrain that gave them cover when they needed it most. He didn't claim to have outsmarted the Germans or to have discovered some tactical innovation that changed the war. He just did his job, and his crew did theirs. And at the end of 30 minutes of chaos, they were still alive while their enemies weren't. That's the real story of armor combat in Normandy. Not the myth of invincible German supertanks defeated by waves of expendable Shermans, but the reality of competent crews making the best of inadequate equipment in terrain that favored neither side. The side that adapted faster, moved more aggressively, and made fewer mistakes won. On July 11th, 1944, that side was the Americans. The hedgerows of Normandy are still there, though many have been removed over the decades as farming modernized. The sunken lanes remain, though they're paved now, part of the rural road network. The fields where Poole's Shermans hunted panthers are quiet, marked only by the occasional memorial or historical marker that tourists stop to photograph. The destroyed panthers were salvaged for scrap years ago. The Shermans that survived the war were either scrapped or ended up in museums, displayed behind velvet ropes with plaques explaining their technical specifications. But the men who crewed those Shermans, the men who proved that competence and aggression could overcome material disadvantage, carried those lessons for the rest of their lives. Some of them stayed in the army, becoming instructors who taught the next generation of tankers how to fight in close terrain. Some returned to civilian life and rarely spoke about the war. Some died in later engagements, their lessons learned too late to save them. But all of them understood something that couldn't be captured in after-action reports or technical manuals, that the outcome of combat is determined by human decisions made under inhuman stress, and that the tank that wins isn't always the one with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It's the one crewed by men who refuse to lose. If you made it this far, consider leaving a comment about what aspect of armored combat you'd like to see covered next. There are countless stories from Normandy and beyond, still waiting to be told.